Rocket Boys by Homer H. Hickam, Jr. Chapter 1, Coalwood. Until I began to build and launch rockets, I didn't know my hometown was at war with itself over its children, and that my parents were locked in a kind of bloodless combat over how my brother and I would live our lives. I didn't know that if a girl broke your heart, another girl, virtuous, at least in spirit, commended on the same night. And I didn't know that the enthalpy decreases in a converging passage could be transformed into jet kinetic energy if a divergent passage was added. The other boys discovered their own truths when we built our rockets, but those were mine. Coalwood, West Virginia, where I grew up, was built for a purpose of extracting the millions of tons of rich bituminous coal that laid beneath it. In 1957, when I was 14 years old and first began to build my rockets, there were nearly 2,000 people living in Coalwood. My father, Homer Hickam, was the mine superintendent, and our house was situated just a few hundred yards from the mine's entrance, a vertical shaft 800 feet deep. From the window of my bedroom, I could see the black steel tower that sat over the shaft and the comings and goings of the men who worked at the mine. Another shaft, with railroad tracks leading up to it, was used to bring out the coal. The structure for lifting, sorting, and dumping the coal was called the tipple. Every weekday, and even on Saturdays, when times were good, I could watch the black coal cars rolling beneath the tipple to receive their massive loads, and then smoke spouting locomotives straining to pull them away. All through the day, the heavy thump of the locomotive's steam pistons thundered down our narrow valleys, the town shaking to the crescendo of grinding steel as the great trains accelerated. Clouds of coal dust rose from the open cars, invading everything, seeping through windows and creeping under doors. Throughout my childhood, when I raised my blanket in the morning, I saw a black, sparkling powder float off it. My socks were always black with coal dirt when I took my shoes off at night. Our house, like every house in Coalwood, was company-owned. The company charged a small monthly rent automatically deducted from the miner's pay. Some of the houses were tiny and single-storied, with only 1 or 2 bedrooms. Others were big, 2-story duplexes built at boarding houses for bachelor miners in the booming 1920s, and later sectioned off as individual family dwellings during the Depression. Every 5 years, all the houses in Coalwood were painted a company white, which the blooming coal soon tinged gray. Usually in the spring, each family took it upon themselves to scrub the exterior of their house with hoses and brushes. Each house in Coalwood had a fenced-off square of yard. My mother, having a larger yard than most to work with, planted a rose garden. She hauled in dirt from the mountains by the sackful slug over her shoulder, and fertilized, watered, and manicured each bush with her exceeding care. During the spring and summer, she was rewarded with bushes filled with great blood-red blossoms, as well as dainty pink and yellow buds, spattered a brave color against the dense green of the heavy forest that surrounded us and the gloom of the black and gray mine just up the road. Our house was on a corner where the state highway turned east toward the mine. A company paved road went the other way to the center of town, Main Street, as it was called. Ran down a valley so narrow in places that a boy with a good arm could throw a rock from one side of it to the other. Every day for 3 years before I went to high school, I got on my bicycle in the morning with a big white canvas bag strapped over my shoulder and delivered the Bluefield Daily Telegraph. down this valley, pedaling past the Colwood School and the rows of houses that were set along a little creek and up on the sides of the facing mountains. A mile down Main was a large hollow in the mountains, formed where two creeks intersected. Here were the company's offices and also the company church and the company hotel called the Club House. The post office building, which also housed the company's doctor and the company dentist, and the main company store, which everybody called the big store. On an overlooking hill was the turreted mansion occupied by the company general superintendent, a man sent down by our owners in Ohio to keep an eye on their assets. Main Street continued westward between two mountains, leading to clusters of miners' houses we called Middletown and Frog Level. Two forks led up mountain hollows to the colored camps of Mudhole and Snake Root. There the pavement ended, and rutted dirt roads began. At the entrance to Mudhole was a tiny wooden church presided over by the Reverend Little Richard. He was dubbed Little because of his resemblance to the soul singer. Nobody up Mudhole Hollow subscribed to the paper, but whenever I had an extra one, I always left it at the little church. And over the years, the Reverend Richard and I became friends. I loved it when he had a moment to come out on the church porch and tell me a quick Bible story while I listened astride my bike, fascinated by the sonorous voice. I especially admire his description of Daniel in the lion's den, when he acted out with bug-eyed astonishment the moment of Daniel's captures, looked down and saw their prisoner lounging around in a pit with his arm around the head of a big lion. I laughed appreciatively. That Daniel, he knew the Lord. The Reverend summed up with a chuckle while I continued to giggle. And it made him brave. How about you, Sonny? Do you know the Lord? I had to admit, I wasn't certain about that, but the Reverend said it was all right. God looks after fools and drunks, he said with a big grin that showed off his gold front tooth. And I guess he'll look after you too, Sonny Hickam. Many a time in the days to come, when I was in trouble, I would think of Reverend Richard and his belief in God's sense of humor and his fondness for never-do-wells. It didn't make me as brave as old Daniel, but it always gave me at least a little hope the Lord would let me scrape by. The company church, the one most of the white people in town went to, was set down on a little grassy knob. In the late 1950s, it came to the presided over by a company employee, Reverend Josiah Lanyard, who also happened to be a Methodist. The denominational of the preacher the company hired automatically became ours too. Before we became Methodists, I remember being a Baptist, and once for a year, some kind of Pentecostal. The Pentecostal preacher scared the woman, hurling fire and brimstone and warnings of death from the pulpit. When his contract expired, we got Reverend Lanier. I was proud to live in Colwood, according to the West Virginia history books. No one had ever lived in the valleys and the hills of McDowell County before. We came to dig out the coal. Up until the early 19th century, Cherokee tribes occasionally hunted in the area but found the terrain otherwise too rugged and uninviting. Once when I was 8 years old, I found a stone arrowhead embedded in the stump of an ancient oak tree up on the mountains behind my house. My mother said a deer must have been lucky some long ago day. I was so inspired by my find that I invented an Indian tribe, the Colhicans, and convinced the boys I played with, Roy Lee, Odell, Tony, and Sherman, that had been really existed. They joined me in streaking our faces with berry juice and sticking chicken feathers in our hair. For days afterwards, our little tribe of savages formed raiding parties and conducted massacres throughout Colwood. We surrounded the clubhouse and with birch branch bows and invisible arrows picked off the single miners who lived there as they came in from work. To indulge us, some of them even fell down and writhed convincingly on the clubhouse's vast, manicured lawn. When we set up an ambush at the tipple gate, the miners going on shift got into the spirit of things, whooping and returning our imaginary fire. My father observed this from his office by the tipple and came out to restore order. Although the Cohicans escaped into the hills, their chief was reminded at the supper table that night that the mine was for work, not play. When we ambushed some older boys, my brother Jim, among them who were playing cowboys up in the mountains, a great mock battle ensued until Tony, up in the tree for a better line of sight, stepped on a rotten branch and fell and broke his arm. I organized the construction of a litter out of branches, and we bore the great warrior home. The company doctor, Doc Lassiter, drove to Tony's house in the ancient Packard and came inside. When he caught sight of us, still in our feathers and war paint, Doc said he was the heap big medicine man. Doc set Tony's arm and put it in a cast. I remember still what I wrote on it. Tony, next time, pick a better tree. Tony's Italian immigrant father was killed in the mine that same year. He and his mother left, and we never heard from them again. This did not seem unusual to me. A Colwood family required a father, one who worked for the company. The company and Colwood were one and the same. I learned most of what I knew about Colwood history in my parents' early years at the kitchen table after the supper dishes were cleared. That was when Mom had herself a cup of coffee and Dad a glass of milk. And if they weren't arguing about one thing or the other, they would talk about the town and the people in it. What was going on at the mine, what had been said at the last women's club meeting, and sometimes little stories about how things used to be. Brother Jim usually got bored and asked to be excused, but I always stayed fascinated by their tales. Mr. George L. Carter, the founder of Colwood, came in on the back of a mule in 1887, finding nothing but wilderness, and after he dug a little, one of the richest seams of bituminous coal in the world. Seeking his fortune, Mr. Carter bought the land from its absentee owner and began construction of a mine. He also built a house, a school building, churches, a company store, a bakery, and an ice house. He hired a doctor and a dentist and provided their services to his miners and their families for free. As the years passed and coal company prospered, Mr. Carter had concrete sidewalks poured, the streets paved, and the town's fenced to keep cows from roaming the streets. Mr. Carter wanted his miners to have a decent place to live, but in return he asked for a decent day's work. Colwood was, after all, a place for work above all else. Hard, bruising, filthy, and sometimes deadly work. When Mr. Carter's son came home from the World War I, he brought with him his army commander, a Stanford University graduate of great engineering and social brilliance named William Laird, who everyone in town called with the greatest respect and deference the captain. The captain, a big, expensive man who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, saw Colwood as a laboratory for his ideas, a place where the company could bring peace, prosperity, and tranquility to its citizens. From the moment Mr. Carter hired him and placed him in charge of operations, the captain began to implement the latest in mining technology. Shafts were sunk for ventilation, and as soon as it was partial, the mules used to haul out the coal from the mines were replaced by electrical motors. Later, the captain stopped all the hand digging and brought in the giant machines called continuous miners. To tear the coal from its seams, the captain expanded Mr. Carter's building program, providing every Coalwood miner a house with indoor plumbing, a warm morning stove in the living room, and a coal box the company kept full. For the town's water supplies, he tapped into a pristine ancient lake that lay 1,000 feet below. He built parks on both ends of the town and founded the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Brownies, Cub Scouts, and the Women's Club. He stocked the Coalwood School Library and built a school playground and a football field. Because the mountains interfered with receptions in 1954, he erected an antenna on a high ridge and provided one of the first cable television systems in the United States as a free service. Although it wasn't perfect, and there was always tension between the miners and the company, mostly about pay, Coalwood was, for a time, spared much of the violence, poverty, and the pain of the other towns in southern West Virginia. I remembered sitting on the stairs in the dark listening to my my poppy, talk to Dad in our living room about Bloody Mingo, a county just up the road from us. Poppy had worked there for a time until war broke out between Union miners and company detectives. Dozens of people were killed and hundreds were wounded in pitched battles with machine guns, pistols, and rifles. To get away from the violence, Poppy moved his family first to Harlan County, Kentucky, and then, when battles erupted there, to McDowell County, where we had to work in the Gary mine. It was an improvement, but Gary was still a place of strikes and lockouts and occasional bloody head. In 1934, when he was 22 years old, my father applied for work as a common miner with Mr. Carter's company. He came because he had heard that a man could make a good life for himself in Coalwood. Almost immediately, the captain saw something in the skinny, hungry lad from Gary, some spark of raw intelligence, perhaps, and took him as a prodigy. After a couple of years, the captain raised Dad to section foreman. He convinced his father to quit the Gary mine and move to Coalwood, where there was no union and a man could work. He also wrote Elise Lavender, a Gary High School classmate who had moved on her own to Florida, to come back to West Virginia and marry him. She refused. Whenever the story was told, Mom took over at this point and said the letter she next received was from the captain, who told her how much Dad loved her and needed her, and would she please stop being so stubborn down there in the palm trees and come to Coalwood and marry the boy. She agreed to come to Coalwood to visit, and one night at the movies in Welch. When Dad asked her to marry him again, she said if he had a brown mule chewing tobacco wrapper in his pocket, she'll do it. He had one, and she said yes. It was a decision that I believed she often regretted, but still would not have changed. Poppy worked in the Coalwood mine until 1943, when a runaway mine cart cut off both of his legs at the hip. He spent the rest of his life in a chair. My mother said that after the accident, Poppy was in continuous pain. To take his mind off it, he read nearly every book in the country library in Welch. Mom said when she and Dad visited, Poppy would be hurting so much he could hardly talk, and Dad would agonize over it for days. Afterwards, finally, a doctor prescribed paregoric, and as long as he had a continuous supply, Poppy found some peace. Dad saw that Poppy had all the paregoric he wanted. Mom said after the paregoric, Poppy never read another book. Because he was so dedicated to the captain and the company, I saw little of my father while I was growing up. He was always at the mine or sleeping prior to going to the mine, or resting after getting back. In 1950, when he was 33 years old, he developed cancer of the colon. At the time, he was working double shifts, leading a section deep inside the mine charges cutting through a massive rock header. Behind the dense sandstone of the header, the captain believed was a vast, undiscovered coal seam. Nothing was more important to my father than to get through the header and prove the captain's right. After months of ignoring the bloody symptoms of his cancer, Dad finally passed out in the mine. His men had to carry him out. It was the captain, not my mother, who rode him in the ambulance to the hospital of Welch. There the doctors gave him little chance for survival. While Mom waited to the Stevens Clinic waiting room, the captain was allowed to watch the operation. After a long piece of his intestine was removed, Dad confounded everybody by going back to work in a month. Another month later, drenched in the rock dust and sweat, his section punched through the header into the softest, blackest, purest coal anyone had ever seen. There was no celebration. Dad came home, showered, and scrubbed himself clean, and went to bed for 2 days. When he got up and went back to work again, then were at least a few times the family was all together. When I was little, Saturday nights were reserved for us to journey over the county seat of Welch, 7 miles and mountains away from the Colwood. Welch was a bustling little commercial town set down by the Tug Fork River. Its tilted streets filled his throngs of miners and their families come to the shop. Women went from store to store with children in their arms or hanging from their hands, while their men, often still in the mine coveralls and helmets, lagged behind to talk about mining and high school football with their fellows. While Mom and Dad visited the stores, Jim and I were deposited at the Pocahontas Theater to watch cowboy movies and adventure serials with hundreds of others miners' kids. Jim would never talk to any of the others, but I always did. Finding out where the boy or the girl who sat next to me was from, it always seemed exciting to me when I met somebody from exotic places like Keystone or Lager mining towns on the other side of the country. By the time I had visited and then watched a serial of double featured, and then had been retrieved by my parents to walk around Welch to finish up Mom's shopping, I was exhausted. I almost always fell sound asleep on the ride home in the backseat of the car. When we got back to Colwood, Dad would lift me over his shoulders and carry me to bed. Sometimes, even when I wasn't asleep, I pretended to be just to know his touch. Shift changes in Colwood were daily major events. Before each shift began, the miners going to work came out of their houses and headed toward the tipple. The miners coming off shift, black with coal, dirt, and sweat, formed another line going to the opposite direction. Every Monday through Friday, the lines formed and met the intersections until hundreds of miners filled our streets. and their coveralls and helmets. They reminded me of the new reels I'd seen of soldiers slogging off to the front. Like everyone else in Colwood, I lived accordingly to the rhythms set by the shifts. I was awakened in the morning by the trump of feet and the clucking of lunch buckets outside at the day shift went to work. I ate supper after Dad saw the evening shift down the shaft, and I went to sleep to the ringing of a hammer on steel and the dry hiss of an arc welder at the little tipple machine shop during the hoot owl shift. Sometimes when the boys were still in grade school and tired of playing in the mountains or dodgeball by the old garages or straight base in the tiny clearing behind my house, we would pretend to be miners ourselves and join the men in their trek to the tipple. We stood apart in the knot and watched them strap on their lamps and gather their tools. And then a bell would ring, a warning to get in the cage. After they were swallowed by the earth, everything became eerily quiet. It was an unsettling moment, and we boys were glad to get back to our games, yelling and brawling a little louder than necessary to shatter the spell cast on us by the tipple. Colwood was surrounded by forests and mountains dotted with caves and cliffs and gas wells and fire towers and abandoned mines just waiting to be discovered and rediscovered by me and the boys and girls I grew up with. Although our mothers forbade it, we also played around the railroad tracks. Every so often, somebody would come up with the idea of putting a penny on the track and getting it run over by the coal carts to make a big flat medal. We'd all do it then until we had used up our meager supplies. Stifling our laughter, we'd hand the crushed coppers around the counters at the company store for candy. The clerk, having seen this many times over the years, usually accepted our tender without comment. They probably had a stack of flat pennies somewhere in the company store offices collected over the decades. For a satisfying noise, nothing beat going up to the Colwood School Bridge and throwing pop bottles into the empty coal cars beneath the bridge. Some of the braver boys would even leap into them, plunging waist deep into the loose coal. I tried it once and barely escaped when the train suddenly pulled out, bound for Ohio. I wallowed through the coal and climbed down the outside ladder of the car and jumped for it, skinning my hands, knees, and elbows on the packed coal around the track. My mother took no pity on me and scrubbed the coal dirt off me with a stiff brush and lava soap. My skin felt raw for a week. When I wasn't outside playing, I spent hours happily reading. I loved to read, probably the result of a unique education I received from the Colwood school teacher known as the Great Six, a corruption of the phrase grades 1 through 6. For years, these same 6 teachers had seen through their classrooms generations of Colwood students. Although Mr. Leakins, the Colwood school principal, controlled the junior high school with a firm hand, the grade 6 held sway in the grades below. It seemed to be very important to these teachers that I read. By the second grade, I was immediately familiar with the capable of discussing in some detail Tom Sawyer and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Huckleberry Finn they saved for me until the 3rd grade, tantalizingly holding it back as if it contained the very secrets of life. When I was finally allowed to read it, I very well knew this was no simple tale of rafting down a river, but the everlasting story of an American itself. With all our glory and shame, bookcases were filled complete sets of Tom Swift, the Bobbery Twins, the Hardy Boys, the Nancy Drews were the grade school hallways and available to any students for their asking. I devoured them, savoring the adventures they brought me. When I was in the 4th grade, I started going upstairs to the junior high school library to check out the Black Stallion series. There, I also discovered Jules Verne. I fell in love with his books, filled as they were with not only great adventures, but scientists and engineers who consider the acquisition of knowledge to the greatest pursuit of mankind. When I was finished all the Verne books in the library, I became the first in line for any book that arrived written by modern science fiction writers such as Heinlein, Asimov, Van Vogt, Clark, and Bradbury. I liked them all unless they branched out into fantasy. I didn't care to read about heroes who could read minds or walk through walls or do magic. The heroes I liked had courage and knew more real stuff than those who opposed them. When the grade 6 inspected my library record and found it top-heavy with adventures and science fiction, they prescribed appropriate doses of Steinbeck, Faulkner, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. It seemed as if all through high school I was reading 2 books, one for me and one for my teachers. For all the knowledge and pleasure they gave me, the books I read in childhood did not allow me to see myself past Colwood. Almost all the grown-ups Colwood boys I knew had either joined the military service or gone to work on the mine. I had no idea that the future held in store for me. The only thing I knew for sure was my mother did not see me going into the mine. One time, after Dad tossed her his check, I heard her tell me, "Whatever you make, Homer, it isn't enough." He replied, "It keeps a roof over your head." She looked at the check and then folded it up and put it in her apron pocket. If you stop working in that hole," she said, "I'll live under a tree." After Mr. Carter sold out, the company was renamed Olga Coal Company. Mom always called it Miss Olga. If anybody asked her where Dad was, she'd said, "With Miss Olga." She made it sound as if it was his mistress. Mom's family did not share her aversion to coal mining. All of her 4 brothers, Robert, Ken, Charlie, and Joe, were miners, and her sisters, Mary and the wife of a miner, despite their father's hideous accident. My father's 2 brothers were also miners. Clarence worked in the Carita mine across the mountain from the Colwood, and Emmett in mines around the country. Dad's sister Benny married a Colwood miner, and they lived down across this creek near the big machine shops. But the fact that all of the family and my father's family were miners did not impress my mother. She had her own opinion, formed perhaps by the independent nature by her ability to see things as they were, not as others, including herself, would wish them to be. And the morning she began her ritual battle against the dust. My mother could nearly always be found with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table in front of the unfinished mural of a seahorse. She had been working on that painting ever since. Dad took off over the mine and we moved into the captain's house. By the fall of 1957, she had painted in the sand and the shells and much of the sky and a couple of seagulls. There was an indication of a palm tree going up too. It was as if she was painting herself, another reality. But from her seat of the table, she could reflect on her roses and birds feeders through the picture window the company carpenters had installed for her. Per her specifications, it was angled so that a hint of mine could be seen. I knew even as a child that my mother was different from just about everybody in Colwood. When I was around 3 years old, we were visiting Poppy in his house of Warrior Mine Hollow, and he took me on his lap. That scared me because he didn't have a lap, just an empty wrinkled blanket where his legs should have been. I struggled in the thick arms while Mom hovered nervously nearby. He's just like Homer. I remembered toothless Poppy lisping to Mom while I squirmed. He called on my dad to the other side of the room. Homer, he's just like you. Mom anxiously took me from Poppy, and I clutched hard to her shoulder, my heart beating wildly from an undefined terror. She carried me out onto the porch, stroking my hair and brushing me. "No, you're not." She crooned just loud enough so only she and I could hear it. "No, you're not." Dad slapped open the screen door and came out to the porch as if to argue with her. Mom turned away from him, and I saw his eyes, usually a bright blue, softened into liquid blots. I snuggled my face into her neck while Mom continued to rock and hold me, still singing her quietly insistent song, "No, you're not, no, you're not." All through my growing up years, she kept singing it, one way or the other. It was only when I was in high school and began to build my rockets that I finally understood why.